Chapter 8. Murray. The archivist, Dennis Thompson, had been bordering on the large side when he and Murray had been on shift together. Now Dennis was as wide as he was tall, with a shiny pate and two sets of glasses perched above his eyebrows. Can't get on with varifocals. He retrieved the reading pair and popped them on the bridge of his nose, then peered at the lids of the two files he had found for Murray. Tom Johnson and Caroline Johnson. The fact that the anonymous card had been delivered on the anniversary of Caroline Johnson's death suggested that there was where suspicions lay. But since her death had been so inextricably linked with her husband's, Murray intended to start at the beginning. Those are the ones, thanks. Dennis pushed an A4 book across the counter. On each page were neat columns recording a signature against every file removed from the archive, along with the date it was returned. Murray picked up the pen, then hesitated. He looked at his old crewmate. I don't suppose. On the QT? Please, I'll get them back before you know it. Sometimes Murray concluded as he left the archive room with the files. There were advantages to having them been around as long as he had. He wanted to look through the case file again on the bus home, but there were two response officers, their ties and epaulets hidden beneath North Face fleeces, sitting directly behind him. They hadn't noticed him. It was funny how invisible you become once you retired. But Murray wasn't about to advertise his presence with illicitly obtaining police files. Instead, he looked out of the window and wondered what Sarah would think about the Johnson case. For most of his career, Murray had taken his work home. In the early years of their marriage, Sarah had struggled through a number of low-paid jobs. Each had required levels of punctuality, politeness, and positivity that had proved impossible for Sarah to sustain, and each had triggered long periods of depression when they had ended prematurely. Eventually, Sarah had given into what Murray had suggested from the start, that she stayed home and he bring home the bacon. It had been a relief for them both. Murray had begun sharing snippets of his day with Sarah. He had been conscious of the confidential boundaries within which he worked, but he was mindful too that on days when Sarah felt unable to leave the house, this insight into the wider world was as important to her as it was interesting. To his surprise, he grew to rely on these exchanges as much as Sarah did, reaping the benefits of a fresh perspective. Untarnished by a police prejudice, he looked forward to telling her about Tom and Caroline Johnson. The bus stopped at the end of Murray Street, a cul-de-sac of chalet bungalows built in the 60s and occupied by a mix of first-timers, families and pensioners. Several of the bungalows had been extended so much they were now rather grand two-story detached houses, their back gardens decked for summer barbecues, with the exception of new carpets and lick of paint every few years. Murray's house looked exactly the way it had looked when he and Sarah bought it in 1984, the year he finished his probationary period and was confirmed as a police officer. Murray didn't get off the bus. Instead, he stayed on for another 5 stops, thanking the driver and walking the short distance to Highfield, once a rather grand country home. The Grade 2 listed building was built in 1811 and had been used by the NHS since the early 50s. Surrounded by lovely gardens, the historic effect was marred somewhat by the surrounding porticobells and cheap, flat-roofed buildings installed to house the growing department that was needed to support his patients like Sarah. Murray was familiar with most parts of Highfield. There were a well-attained drop-in centre with craft activities, a patient-run cafe, and a peer support group. There were outpatient clinics, counselling service, and cookery classes for patients with eating disorders. There were wards for patients with various mental health problems, requiring varying levels of support, including a high security ward on which Sarah had spent 10 days in 2007, and which Murray could no longer pass without remembering the awful day he had pleaded with the doctors to section his wife. Sarah had been upfront about her diagnosis the first time she and Mary had met, at the buffet lunch laid on after Murray's passing out parade. Her older brother Carl had been part of the same intake, and although the two men hadn't been friends, Murray had been drawn to the vivacious girl standing with Carl's family. He wondered if she was Carl's girlfriend, had been relieved to discover she wasn't. You know I'm mental, right? Sarah had thrown it down like a challenge. She'd been wearing enormous silver hooped earrings and swung when she laughed in a luminous pink batwing jumper that hurt his eyes. Murray hadn't laughed, partly because political correctness had been part of his makeup long before it had become part of police vocabulary, but mainly because he couldn't reconcile the term with the woman opposite him. She had so much energy, she couldn't stay still, and her eyes sparkled as though they saw joy in everything. There was nothing mental about Sarah. Borderline personality disorder, she smiled. That big smile again. It sounds worse than it is, I promise. BPD. Those three letters had bookended their relationship ever since. Murray had swiftly realized the sparkle appeared only on Sarah's better days, and that between times the pain and fear in those slate grey eyes would be unbearable. Currently, Sarah was a voluntary patient on a ward where Murray knew someone by name. Visiting hours were restricted, but staff was understanding about Murray's shift patterns, and he signed his name in the book and waited in the family room while someone fetched Sarah. Family rooms were different in every hospital and clinic. Sometimes you feel you're in a prison visiting centre with staff wards and uniformed members of staff watching over you. In other places, they were more relaxed with sofa and a TV, and staff dressed so casually you had to check for a name badge to make sure they weren't patients. The family room at Highfield fell somewhere in between. It was divided in two sections. In the first, an art and craft table boasted colour papers and pots of felt-tip pens. Fiddly sticky pads were provided for children and the parents to embellish their homemade cards without the safety risk presented by stolen rolls of sellotape. The scissors were plastic-coated with rounded ends. In the second part of the room where Murray took a seat were sofas and low coffee tables, scattered with magazines several months out of date. Sarah put arms around him and hugged him hard. How are you feeling? Sarah wrinkled her nose. There's a new girl in the room next to me who bangs her head against the wall when she's stressed. She paused. She's stressed a lot. Hard to sleep? Sarah nodded. Be quieter at home. Murray saw the flick of anxiety across Sarah's face. He didn't push it. It had been 3 weeks since Sarah had cut herself so badly she needed stitches in both wrists. A cry for help, the A&E sisters had said. When it was discovered that Sarah had already called an ambulance, a bag in the hall contained the few things she needed at Highfield. I could feel it happening again, she said to Murray, when she'd broken every speed limit to get to the hospital. It, an indefinable, overwhelming presence in their lives. It stopped Sarah going out. It meant she found it hard to make friends, and even harder to keep them. It lay beneath the surface of Murray's and Sarah's lives, always there, always waiting. Why didn't you phone Mr. Chowdhury? Murray had said. He wouldn't admit me. Murray had held her, tried to empathize, but finding it impossible to relate to a logic that saw self-harming as the only route into a place of safety. I had an interesting day, he said now. Sarah's eyes lit up. She sat on the sofa cross-legged, with her back against the arm. Murray had never seen his wife sit properly on a sofa. She would lie on the floor or sprawl with her head dangling off the edge of the seat and her legs stretched up so her toes touched the wall. Today Sarah was wearing a long grey linen dress, teamed with bright orange hoodie with sleeves that she had pulled over her hands so often that now stayed there of her own accord. A woman came in to report that the patient's suicides were in fact murderers. Do you believe her? As usual, Sarah cut straight to the chase. Murray hesitated. I honestly don't know, he told Sarah about Tom and Caroline Johnson and their rucksacks filled with rocks that witnessed report the chaplain's intervention. Finally, he told her about the anonymous anniversary card and Anna Johnson's insistence that he reopen the investigations into his parents' death. Were either the parents suicidal? Not according to Anna Johnson. Caroline Johnson had no history of depression prior to her husband's death, and his real suicide had been completely out of the blue. Interesting. There was a spark in Sarah's eyes, and Murray felt warmth spread through him. When Sarah was unwell, her world shrank. She lost interest in anything outside of her own life, displaying a selfishness that was far removed from the woman she really was. Her interest in Johnson Job was a good sign, a great sign, and Murray was doubly glad he had decided to take a look at the case. It hadn't troubled him that the subject matter might have been sensitive for a woman with a long history of self-harm. He had never tiptoed around Sarah in the way that so many of their friends had done. They had been having coffee with a colleague of Murray's one time when a discussion had begun on Radio 4 about suicide rates among young people. Alan had lunged across his kitchen to turn off the radio, leaving Murray and Sarah exchanging amused glances. I'm ill, Sarah said gently when Alan had taken his seat again and the kitchen was quiet. It doesn't mean we can't talk about mental health issues or suicide. Alan had looked to Murray for reassurance, and Murray had staunchly refused to make eye contact. Nothing was more likely to set the tightrope on which Sarah lived than thinking she was being judged, talked about. If anything, it makes me more interested than your average layperson, Sarah had confirmed, and frankly, she had given Alan a wicked grin. If anyone's an expert on suicide around here, it's me. People like boxes. Murray had concluded. You were ill for you were well. You were ill or you were well, mad or sane. Sarah's problem was that she climbed in and out of boxes, and people didn't know how to deal with that. Have you got the files with you? Sarah looked around for his briefcase. I haven't looked at them myself yet. Bring them tomorrow? Sure. He looked at his watch. I'd better go. Hope you get a bit more sleep tonight. She walked him to the door and hugged him goodbye. And Murray kept a smile on his face until he was safely out of sight. Sometimes it was easier to leave Sarah or Highlands when she was having a bad day, easier to go home when she was curled up in a ball in her bed because he knew she was in the best possible place, that she'd be safe, looked after. But when Sarah was calm, happy, even every step away felt like a step in the wrong direction. How could Highfield, with its clinical smell and cell-like bedrooms, be better than her comfortable, cozy bungalow? How could Sarah feel safer in hospital than at home? Later, when he had cleared away his plate and washed the pan he'd used for his omelette, Murray sat at the table and opened Johnson's files. He read through the call logs, the witness statement, and the police reports. He looked at the photographs of exhibits, Tom Johnson's abandoned wallet and his wife's handbag, and read the text messages sent by each of them prior to the deaths. He scrutinized the summing up from each inquest and the coroner's verdict of suicide. Murray laid everything out on the kitchen table along with the evidence bag containing the anonymous card sent to Anna Johnson when he placed it in the middle between her parents' files. After reading through the coroner's report one more time, he put them at the back of the table and snapped open a brand new notebook, as symbolic as it was practical. If Anna's mother had been murdered, Murray needed to approach this investigation as though it was fresh out of the box. And that meant starting from the beginning with Tom Johnson's suicide. Murray had been a detective in 1989 when files had still been written longhand, and cracking crime had meant legwork, not cyber sleuthing. By 2012, when Murray had retired, the job had changed beyond all recognition, and among the feelings of loss as he handed in his warrant card was a barely acknowledged streak of relief. He had found it increasingly hard to get to grips with technology, and still preferred to write his statements with the engraved fountain pen that had been Sarah's present to him when he had won a place on CID. For a second, Murray felt his confidence waver. Who did he think he was, that he'd find something in these files that hadn't been seen before? He was 60, retired from the force, and now working as a civilian. He spent the last 5 years checking driving license and taking reports on lost property. He fiddled with the fountain pen in his hand, ran his fingers over the writing. D.C. Mackenzie. Pulling his sleeves over his hand, he buffed the silver until it shone. He wished Sarah was there. Remember the post office robbery? He imagined her saying, there were no leads, no forensic, no one had a clue, no one except you. They'd been close to filing the job, but Murray hadn't let it lie. He hit the streets, knocking doors, shaking up the community. He tapped on his network of informants, and a graduate name had emerged. The lad had gone down for 14 years. That was a long time ago, a voice whispered in his head. Murray shook it away. He gripped his pen. The job might have changed, but criminals hadn't. Murray had been a good detective, one of the best. That hadn't changed.